Last week we considered the question, is death annihilation? So is it the cessation of all consciousness? And we saw some arguments against, but probably stronger arguments were for the claim that death is annihilation. And at the beginning of the course, we saw Socrates bravely facing up to his own death. And one of the possibilities he considered was that death is something like a dreamless sleep in which the dreamer is the sleeper is unaware of what's going on, and he was not afraid of that. He thought it was foolish to be afraid of it. Um, this week, we'll be looking at the question, well, if death is annihilation, is it bad for the person who dies? And what should our attitude towards death be? So this is a zoom in on the badness of death. We'll be looking at writings from three philosophers, so Epicurus, Lucretius, and a contemporary philosopher, Thomas Nagel. So you'll see this conversation spans about 2,000 years. Let's look at the argument Epicurus proposes. And I put a big argument here, but I'm going to walk us through every step. So first, there are many things that many aspects of death and dying which somebody might be afraid of. Somebody might be afraid of the process of dying, which can be painful and rob people of their dignity in some circumstances. You could be afraid of what your death might mean for the people around you, and those are all, it seems like, legitimate reasons for fear. But what seems to be the central thing about death that people fear is how it might be bad for them. Or if it's not the primary thing that they fear, then at least it seems to be a common source of fear of death is, will my death be bad for me? And I'm afraid that it will be bad for me. So we're going to set aside all those worries about death that might be rooted in the process of dying, or how your death might be bad for the people around you and concern for them, and focus just on, is your death bad for you, right? Is my death bad for me? Now, when we talk about what we should fear and what we maybe shouldn't fear, that might sound like a strange question, a strange issue to be investigating. You might have the attitude, well, people have the attitude towards death that they have. What sense does it make to say they should have a different attitude, or they should have the attitude that they have? Aren't you thereby invalidating somebody's feelings? And we do run the risk of that by asking this question, what should somebody's attitude be towards death? But there may be some benefits to it, as we'll see in Epicurus's considerations. So to get us to thinking a little bit about why we might ask this sort of question, let's think about appropriateness conditions for various emotions, right? So think about the emotion of, or the feeling of, a feeling of pride, right? Like you might be proud of all sorts of things that you've done. But imagine a student, for example, turns in an essay that they didn't write, and I give them a good grade. And imagine the student was beaming with pride over the grade that they received. We might say to that person, well, you might be proud that you got away with it, but it doesn't make sense to be proud of the grade you got in that circumstance because you turned in work that wasn't yours. You didn't do it. So it seems that pride, an appropriateness condition of pride, is that you actually did something, right? Although there are cases where people are proud of their country, proud of their family, things which they're not really in control over. It seems like in normal cases, doing something is an appropriate condition for pride. Similarly, it seems there are appropriateness conditions for fear. If well, one condition seems to be that there's a good chance, or at least a greater than zero chance, that something will happen, that something bad will happen to you, right? So if you're afraid of blowing up in a space shuttle, but you're taking no steps to ever getting on a space shuttle, then fear of blowing up on a space shuttle seems inappropriate, right? And then it also seems to be an appropriateness condition that it's a bad thing. Not that it's a good thing or that it's a neutral thing. If I told you you were going to get a scoop of ice cream and you said, I'm terrified, I would say, oh, you definitely need to see a therapist about that. There's something, unless you're allergic to dairy, then you have some sort of phobia that you need to work out in therapy. Similarly, if I said you're going to walk through the door, and you said, oh yeah, I know I have to walk through that door, I'm terrified of it, then you'd have a fear of like just a neutral thing, and that seems really strange. I mean, unless it was a door to a house that was collapsing, that again would seem like a phobia, something you would want to take steps to get rid of. But if it was a bad thing and there's a good chance that it'll happen to you, then it might make sense that you should fear something. And on the face of it, it seems that death meets those criteria. So there's a good chance, it's going to happen to you. And then in addition to that, it seems on the face of it to be a bad thing. So fear seems only appropriate. Well, two of the authors that we read for this week, Epicurus and Lucretius, think that that's not the case. They think you should not fear death because it's not going to be bad for you. So Epicurus's argument goes something like this. It's rational for a person, we'll put X to stand for that person, rational for X to fear or be anxious about something for X's own sake, only if it's bad for X. So setting aside the fears that they might have for other people's sake, it's rational for you to be afraid of something for your own sake, only if it's going to be bad for you. And if a person's, I'll just substitute if your death is going to be bad for you, Epicurus says, then there's two times when it might be bad for you. It might be bad for you when you're alive, or it might be bad for you when you're dead. Now, it's weird to say that somebody's death would be bad for them when they're alive, because as Epicurus points out, they're not dead yet. So this is premise 3. The living have yet to experience death. It's weird to say that something's bad for somebody when it hasn't happened yet. Then it would only be, somebody could say, well, the fear of death is bad. But here's exactly what we're wondering. Is the thing bad itself? So if we retreat back to the anxiety of it, then we're begging the question, right? So it would be weird to say, oh, Brian's death is horrible for him when Brian is still alive, right? So your death can't be bad for you while you're living. Then Epicurus says, uploading the conclusion of the arguments we looked at last week, death is the end of all awareness. So death is annihilation, the end of all awareness, the end of all consciousness. And something can be good or bad for someone only if that person is aware of it or becomes aware of it. And I think Epicurus would say when they become aware of it, and if it's a bad thing or if it's a good thing, right? So the idea here is that you have to feel the goodness of a good thing or feel the badness of a bad thing for it to be good or bad for you. And if death is the end of all awareness, then you won't be able to feel the badness of it. So your death can't be bad for you when you're dead. So it's not bad for you when you're alive. It's not bad for you when you're dead. So note the disjunctive syllogism here. He's saying one or the other, not one and not the other, therefore neither, right? So fear, anxiety about one's own death for one's own sake is irrational. So not bad for you when you're alive, not bad for you when you're dead. Irrational to fear a bad thing. So irrational to fear death. So Epicurus poses what we might call an awareness requirement for harms. In order for something to be bad for somebody, they have to be aware of it. Now, you might propose an objection. Well, imagine somebody has cancer, but they're not yet aware of it. It hasn't been diagnosed. Isn't having cancer a bad thing for them? And Epicurus might say, well, look, it's not bad for them until they learn about it and it causes grief, or until it has bad effects for them that they can feel, right? Just having the cancer, not bad until it brings about bad effects that the person can feel, the pain, the fear, etc. Right? So Epicurus has a way of responding to that cancer objection, right? So if Epicurus poses an awareness requirement, Lucretius poses what we might call an existence requirement. So he says something can be good or bad for you only if you exist. It would be weird to say that something was bad for you. Something is bad for something that's happening right now is bad for George Washington, right? He doesn't exist right now. So it makes sense that something can be good or bad for you only if you exist. And when you're dead, of course, you don't exist. Therefore, death can't be bad for you, Lucretius reasons. So he proposes, whereas Epicurus had the awareness requirement, Lucretius proposes here what we might call an existence requirement for benefits and harms. In order for something to be a benefit or harm for somebody, that somebody must exist. Now, are there objections to this argument? Well, you could object to two. I mean, you could go against the death as annihilation things, that somehow you live after you die. But we dealt with those arguments last week. You might also go after premise one. Something can be good or bad for you only if you exist. And you might say, well, I can think of an example. Imagine right before somebody's born, there's a horrible stock market crash. And that stock market crash leads to a long depression for the country that person was born into, and their parents lose, all their wealth right before they're born. We might say, well, look, isn't that stock market crash bad for that person who was about to be born, and they didn't exist when that happened? And how would Epicurus or Lucretius respond to that? Well, one thing Lucretius might say is, well, look, the stock market crash itself was not bad, but the effects of the stock market crash, so the lack of wealth, and so the lack of wealth, maybe the lack of food on the table, the feeling of being hungry, like those are the things that are bad. So when the person is existing, if you're Lucretius, or when the person becomes aware, feels the pain that's a result of that thing that happened before, then that's when we can say, all right, that's bad right now. So something to note is if we can come up with an easy counterexample to Lucretius's principle that something can be good or bad for you only if you exist, the easiest examples to come up with are events before somebody's going to live, because they're then going to exist to feel the badness that might have trickled down from that initial cause, right? It's harder to come up with examples after somebody dies, how something might be bad for that person. I mean, you hear the expression somebody's rolling in their grave, right? But do we really think that, to go back to the case of George Washington, if this country collapses, that's bad for George Washington? Difficult to say, right? I mean, we think that one thing that people seem to value is leaving a legacy, and you want your life to have some effects, but then Lucretius and Epicurus, some effects that live on after your life. But Epicurus and Lucretius are here to point out that you won't be around to know whether that's